Welcome to today's CPSA webinar. Today we'll be looking at proactive prospecting and how to turn an interruption into a sales conversation. My name is Tibor Shanto, and I'm a principal with Rembo Sales Solutions. And we work with companies from Imperial Oil to Pitney Bowes, Belt Mobility, Ricoh, and dozens of others, helping their teams sell better by focusing on the front end of the cycle. One of the programs is proactive prospecting that you'll be getting highlights of today. And as we go through the program, don't worry about capturing every single idea in one way, as you can go to this website and be able to download the entire presentation that you'll be walking through today. But as you do go through, I would challenge you on an aspect. We all go through these webinars and we see a lot of good ideas with the great intent of putting them into practice, only to find that life gets in the way, email, voicemail, and by the next morning, there's little evidence of the enthusiasm that we had in the webinar. And we tend to stay back in our box as a result. So what I'm going to ask you to do as we go through the webinar today is write down the things that you think about that you disagree with me, things that maybe make you feel uncomfortable, maybe things that you knew you should be doing, or maybe things that you maybe were trying to figure out how to do. And then at the end of the webinar, pick 3 that you want to put a focus on. If they don't necessarily have to be the hardest 3, but 3 that you want to put a focus on to improve your game, and then write those down. And what you'll find is as a result of that, there's a greater chance that you'll succeed. But what's really proven to be successful is if you write it down and share it with somebody that will remind you of what it is that you committed to do. It's been shown that you have a 66% greater chance of succeeding at whatever it is that you commit to doing when you write it down and share it with somebody. So share it with a colleague, a significant other, a manager. If you want, share it with me. Happy to learn what it is that you put a commitment to, but the goal is take something away that you're actually going to put into practice that will make a difference to your sales. So I think it's important that we deal with definitions throughout. So let's start by looking at what we're doing today. That is that we're taking sales accepted leads and converting them into opportunities. So let's look at what a sales accepted lead is, and let's go to a source that I think most of us know, Serious Decisions. They defined it as a lead that's been accepted, that acknowledges that it's a lead that's been agreed to that meets the attributes, whether you have an SLA or not. So whether you source that yourself, so you think that it's a viable lead, or whether it's something that marketing vetted and delivered as a lead, but you all agree that it's a lead, it's one that you're willing to run with. And that's the issue, is that when I speak to most salespeople, if I describe a lead like this, and ask them, is this something you're willing to run with? Is this something you're willing to invest time in? Or do you think you could do something better with your time? They all say that they want to run with it, they're willing to go with it, they're very enthusiastic at the opportunity of getting a sale. But then we asked a similar question about prospecting, and today we're going to focus on telephone prospecting. It's been shown, especially earlier parts of this year, several studies have shown that your best opportunities in prospecting come when you combine telephone, email, and LinkedIn. It's been shown that if you take any one of those 3 elements out, your chances of success diminish measurably. Unfortunately, the one that they all want to take out is the telephone, and so they rely on email and LinkedIn, and they do okay, but they could do actually good by adding the telephone back in. The telephone has one thing that the other 2 don't, which is you actually got to deal with a human being in the process of making a cold call or a telephone prospecting call. Whereas in email, you can hide behind email, you can hide behind LinkedIn. Rejection is a bit of a different nature. And that's the big thing. It's the number one reason people don't like to pick up the telephone and make money, make calls, which to me equates making money, is rejection. And they proactively look for programs that quote unquote help them avoid rejection because they don't want to deal with it. But the reality is that if you're going to use the telephone for prospecting, if you're going to use email, LinkedIn for prospecting, you're going to face rejection. So I want you to focus on not how to avoid rejection, but accept that it's coming, and then learn how to deal with it. Learn how to deal with the specific objections you're going to get. Now, there is one foolproof way, if you're looking for it, there is one proven way to avoid rejection when it comes to telephone prospecting, but it has particular side effects that most companies don't want to live with. And the proven way is not to pick up the phone, because that is about the only way that you're not going to get rejected. So let's move forward understanding that rejection is coming, and we're going to learn how to deal with it. But here's the question. If you look across stats, And this is for all B2B. So some industries will do better, some won't. But again, this is B2B, from selling nails to selling nuclear power plants. The average close of a sales accepted lead is defined before as a lead that's accepted. The average close is 16.41%. Now, some industries, I work with some companies that are considerably higher, some considerably slower. We're looking at averages here. So 16.41% success rate. If we look at a prospecting program like mine or several other good ones that are on the market, the average contact to appointment, so I'm talking right person contact, I'm talking receptionists, so people who are not involved in the decision. We're talking about right person contact to appointment is roughly about 14% versus the 16.41% for sales accepted leads. And here's a question I have for you. How is it that as salespeople, we're okay with a rejection rate of 83.59% when it comes to a sales accepted lead, but we seem to flip out when it comes to a rejection rate of 86% when it comes to a contact to appointment? Seriously, it's 2.5%, so it can't really be that bad. It's not like dropping into the fire. So why is it? And what I found is that in most instances, most companies have some form of a sales process once they have a sales accepted lead. They know how to walk it through their process, and that process will have several attributes. This is a generic version of the one that we work with our clients, where you have specific stages, specific activities, measures, and a decision actually as to whether you want to go on to the next step or not, because again, resources, money, time, money, all those things are involved. And in each of those instances, whether the process is ours or one that exists, there's plan B in case there's a bottleneck, there's plan C, at times there's even plan Z. So there's various steps that the salesperson is encouraged to take on their journey in helping the customer buy their product. And as a result, they know what to do, when to do it, and so forth. So when they get to that 83.59 rejection rate at the end, it doesn't seem as bad, because they can contextualize, if you will, rationalize the loss, because they can explain how they did everything they were supposed to do, and yet still the gods expired against them, and they didn't get their sale. So I'm going to argue that the reason that we seem to have this different view of rejection when it comes to these two elements of the sale is that in prospecting, there really isn't a process. There's your desk, there's your phone, there's your territory. But in most instances, I'm not saying all, but in most instances, there isn't a process. So what I'd like to do is introduce a flow that will follow through the presentation today that will help you improve incrementally your prospecting on an ongoing basis. So we're going to look at dynamics. We're going to look at time and timing. We're also going to explore how those two relate around metrics, and then some context around how we communicate value to customers, how we put all that into prospecting, how we put it into practice. And then I'm going to put an emphasis on persistence. And then, as you'll see on every slide, it is about execution. Everything else is just talk. And let's face it, in sales, there's plenty of talk. So first thing is dynamics. And almost every program out there in sales, and specifically prospecting, does a good job around the notion of content. What it is that I have to say in order to communicate something to my prospect. What they seem to lack are elements on the other side of the scale, which is the dynamics, which is specifically looking at the environment of the prospect at the time that we make this unexpected call. Because the reality is unless the call is scheduled, it doesn't matter what the nature of the call is. You could have met this person the night before the networking meeting, and it was, yeah, give me a call, but you didn't schedule the call, then you're interrupting them. So again, you have to take into account what's going on at their place. Could be a heavy workload day, could be their bosses on their back. So we got to take their dynamics into account, because in many instances, the people that we're working with are people that are trying to pack 16 hours into a 10-hour day. Again, we often read about layoffs and things like that. That doesn't mean the work goes away, just the people go away and the people left behind have to do the work. So they're already under pressure from internal factors before they get an interruption from us. So part of the thing I like you to do is get you to change your attitude when it comes to your own role in the process. Next time somebody asks you what you do for a living, with pride and a straight back and a smile on your face, I want you to tell them that you're a professional interrupter. What you do is basically interrupt people professionally. Now, you're going to change their life for the better. You're going to have a very positive impact on their career. but you are interrupting them at the moment that you're calling them, and that is something that we have to deal with and know and factor into account when we call them, because as a result of that interruption, we set a series of events into motion, and if we're not ready to deal with those, then the call can go sideways. So again, it's very important that you remember that unless the call is scheduled, and that's crucial, unless the call is scheduled, it doesn't matter how friendly the conversation was the night before around the cheese tray at the networking event. Unless the call is scheduled, we're an interruption, and effectively, we're T-boning their day as you see on the screen. The other thing that we don't have benefit of, whether it's LinkedIn, well, LinkedIn, they can see your smiling face, but that's about it. In LinkedIn and email and telephone is we don't have body language. And since 60% of communication is body language, it's important that we take into account what happens when we remove body language from the equation. So one of the things I'd like to get you to think about is a particular prospect that you're working with now. You know, I'd like to think of a specific individual, not an abstract, but a specific individual, a director of this at this company, a manager of that at this company, a VP of whatever. So again, I want you to think about a specific person that you're trying to sell to now. And think about how many different decisions they have to make. So ours is one product, but how many other products do they have to make decisions around on an ongoing basis, even if not daily, weekly, monthly, whatever the case might be. And then remember that each of those products, like yours, there's probably 2 or 3 competitors, and each of those has a salesperson, and each of those is making calls, just like you're expected to make calls, right? So I'd like you to think about how many unexpected interruptions or prospecting approaches that prospect typically gets in a given business day. So again, think of the products, the sellers, everything else. How many of these kind of approaches do you think that prospect gets? And when I'm working with groups, they generally tell me anywhere between 5 to 20. So let's go down at the lower end of that. If they're getting 5 calls on a day-to-day basis, if they work a year, 48 weeks, that's about 1,200 calls. And if they've done the same job for about 5 years, even if it's across 5 different companies, the question remains that they had 6,000 calls. How are we going to sound different? And again, that's something to think about, because part of dynamics is how the customer reacts. And how they react is a question of what we put on the table. So the words, the way that we phrase them. If we sound like one of those other 6,000 guys, we're going to suffer the same fate as one of those 6,000 guys. So it is important that we think about how we sound different, both in terms of tonal as well as content and context. So let's look at time. And I like to call time the great equalizer, because at the strike of midnight, we all get 24 hours. And how we use those 24 hours, how we put them into effect, how we invest them really determines our success. And I've never heard a salesperson come to me and say that they've run out of skills. But on a day-to-day basis, they tell me that they lost the deal or something happened because they ran out of time. So time becomes a very crucial thing, because it is the only non-renewable resource that we have, because leads are recyclable. So what we want to do is figure out how we maximize our return on time. So I'll ask a question here, which is, how many folks in the audience have taken a time management program? And the reason I ask is I want to apologize in advance for saying that, to me, time management has got to be one of the stupidest concepts ever thrust on man. And here's why. If you think about it, time is already managed. There's 24 hours to a day, 7 days to a week, 52 weeks to a year. Everybody agrees on that. Even mortal enemies will agree on that. So the question becomes, what can I do with time if I don't need to waste time managing it? So I'm going to argue that you can allocate time. If you understand what's important to you, then you can allocate resources to attaining what's important to you. So if you've ever worked with a financial planner or a wealth manager or what have you, you'll recall that they spent a lot of time at the beginning trying to understand who and what you are, what your goals were, what your aspirations were, what your fears were. So they tried to understand what your profile was, so they can then, by understanding what you have and where you're trying to go, they could then allocate specific amounts of your funds to specific investment vehicles so they can get the return that's desired for them. So if we apply the same concept to sales, you can do an interesting thing. I'm going to introduce a number here. The number is 1,760. And at first glance, let's look at it as hours, because it is the amount of quote-unquote face time that we salespeople talk about, that we have time to sell. 220 days a year, 8 hours a day. That's how we get to 1,760. But unfortunately, most of us tend to think of time as being something fluid and sort of shapeless. And as a result, we don't respect it the way that we should as that non-renewable resource. So I always talk about the example of a buddy coming to your desk and asking if you want to grab a cup of coffee when you're about to start prospecting or doing something else. And you say, yeah, let's go grab a cup of coffee. And 20 minutes later, other than the coffee, you have little to show for it. If the same individual came to you and said, I'm going to take $2,000 out of your pocket, I'm never going to give it back to you, how would you feel about that? And that's what I want you to look at, is the 1,760s, not as hours, but as dollars, right? So how am I going to invest those 1,760 hours if I'm going to get the success that I want to get? So if you think about your company coming to you as the wealth manager and giving you $1,760 and telling you that we're expecting you to get a return of 10% on that in the form of your quota, then what are you going to invest the 1,760 hours in order to have success? And that's what I'd like you to think about for a moment. So think about it across the course of a cycle, not the course of a day. So if your sales cycle is 4 months, then think about these activities over the course of 4 months as opposed to a day, because things are seasonal and do fluctuate. But over the course of 4 months, I'm going to assume that you need to prospect, otherwise you wouldn't be on this webinar. So once you've prospected them, you're going to need to sell them. Once you've sold them, you're going to need to manage that account, because it's a lot easier to manage that account than getting a new one. And then on the admin, we're going to have a bucket that's important to you as a salesperson, but not client-facing. So training, webinars with Shanto, things that are, again, crucial to your success, but not facing the customer. And then we always have to do prep and research before we do anything, always a good idea. So what I'd like you to think about is 2 things, and feel free to turn off the webinar. I'll be here when you come back. What I'd like you to do is think about, in addition to the activities that I have on the screen, and don't get granular, stay at a high level, is there anything else that you are required to invest your time in, or to spend, if you will, again, using the financial analogy, time in? I'll give you a couple of examples. I had to do this webinar. If it was live, as I do with some other partners, then I have to invest that time. When I'm doing training, it's in daylight hours, so I have to invest some of my 1,760 hours in order to do that training. When I'm doing public speaking, again, it's usually in daylight hours. So you get the hint here. There's things that are particular to your sales that you may have to invest time in. You may be a small shop and you have to implement and install what you sell. So that would be an example of that. So take a minute, turn off the webinar. First thing I want you to think about is, are there other activities? And then once you've completed that exercise, what percentage of a hypothetical 4-month cycle you need to allocate to each of these activities? So feel free to turn it off. As I said, I will be here when you return. You're back, and so am I. So let's look at it differently. First question I ask you, are there other activities? So I like to put aside what I call tango time, and that's basically dedicated to those 3 things that I talked about earlier in the webinar, when I encourage you to write down all the things that I'm going to say that you don't agree with, or actions that you might want to take, and so on. Because it's one thing to write them down, but I said that I want you to action them, because again, we don't want it to be just a sheet of paper. So you need to allocate time to actually action, thinking about, today I committed to leaving voicemail. How am I going to leave voicemail? I'm going to practice that for 5-10 minutes. I'm not saying hours. 5-10 minutes could be, just before you're prospecting, or whatever the case is. But it's no use writing it down that you're going to change it if you're not going to allocate time to changing it. Then the other thing is what I call firefighting. And these are not your day-to-day, where's my invoice, or do you know when that part is coming in, or do you have the POD type of call. That's account management, right? And really, you should direct as many of that to customer support as possible. But I'm talking like, let's be practical. Let's say there's a fiery meteor coming at the building where your customer writes the checks that you get your commissions from. And you're the only person on the planet that could stop that meteor from hitting that building. That, to me, is a firefighting emergency. But the reality is that these fires come in on a regular basis. I may not know what time of day, what the nature of the fire is going to be, but over the years, you get pretty good at knowing that at least an hour a week, at least 5 hours a week, whatever the cadence is in your industry, is going to be consumed by client emergencies that you do have to deal with, otherwise the revenue tap turns off. The problem is that most salespeople don't allocate for these two times, improving themselves and dealing with fires, even though they know, like if you sat down with them, they tell you, they know that stuff's going to hit in and that they're going to have to deal with it. It's going to distract them from whatever activity that they thought they were going to be doing that day. So you can get ahead of that by actually allocating time for that, by actually allocating time for everything that you're going to do as a professional salesperson. So what I want you to think about is your calendar as being your time manager, not you as being your time manager. And if you will, this may look a bit scary, but let's take a look at it. You know, in the morning I got Smile and Dial. I'm not saying that's the best time to do it, but that day, that Friday, Smile and Dial, I did from 7 o'clock to whatever time I have. Notice I'm also very sort of particular about email and voicemail because, you know, anything that goes into my email and voicemail is going to stay there. So I don't have to worry about it. So that means I can concentrate a full hour on a particular activity. And as adults, we all function better uninterrupted. When we're interrupted, even in the smallest way, it takes us 7 or 8 minutes just to get back up to the pace that we were at before the moment of interruption. And I want you to think about why you're prospecting on the phone. I don't care about other activities in life. I'm here to talk about prospecting. So I want you to think about the time that you're prospecting on the phone as being valuable, and you don't want to be interrupted. And prospecting itself is more valuable than the interruption itself. So I want you to not worry about any emails or voicemails that come in because they're going to be waiting in your inbox. And if any of them are missing, you come to me and I'll give you $100. Now, if you're one of those guys that's raising your hand and saying, Tibor, I got this big important proposal out there. I'm waiting for a note back from the guy. First of all, an hour is not going to make a difference in that, but let's say it is. You can look at the subject line without going into the email. The problem is most people go into the email and that just consumes, or if you will, wastes their time. You'll also notice around 1 o'clock, I have time allocated to shipping, handling, inventory, and turnover. Do the acronym. When it hits the fan, I've allocated time for it. Now, if nothing comes in and hits the fan, I'm still okay because I could put that time to use in any way that I want because it's my time as opposed to somebody else's time. But here's the problem. If you don't allocate for it and the fire comes in, you're going to steal time from something else, which means something else is not going to get done or it's not going to be done in a proper way because we're trying to deal with less time, even though we know we need more time to achieve that. And here's the worst part of it in sales is as human beings, and salespeople are human beings, contrary to rumors, as human beings, the thing that we will take time away from most is the thing that we like least. And since prospecting is what salespeople like least, they take time away from that to fight fires, and they're just perpetuating their decline down. So really, get ahead of it. This looks a bit jumbled, but you'll find that it really helps you guide your day to success. Now, the other thing that this will help you guide you to is to avoid the other curse of salespeople, which is multitasking. I know everybody fancies themselves being a multitasker, but you know, to me, it's just another stupid concept because for me, it's an opportunity not to get a whole bunch of things done at once. And again, the one way to avoid multitasking is to get ahead of it by using your calendar to help you allocate time to the right activities and then manage your activities within the time that you allocated it to. So the other thing that this will help you with is hand in hand with metrics is how do I figure this out? So on a simple basis, metrics will help you with your time and time will help you with metrics, and the two combined will help you improve specific tasks. Let me illustrate. For one proposal, you may need for one sale, you might need 2 real proposals, and for 1 real proposal, you might need 2 prospects, and for 1 prospect, you're probably going to need 1 appointment. If we convert that into the real world, if you need 3 sales in a given month, you're going to need 6 proposals, you're going to need 12 prospects, and to get to those prospects, you're going to need to have 24 appointments. So right away, I know that I'm going to have to dedicate at least 48 hours to that alone because none of my prospects live across the street. Most of them at minimum are a half-hour drive, but generally 45 minutes to an hour. So each 1-hour appointment that I have out of my office, I have to allocate 2 extra hours, another extra hour, 2 extra hours for. So that 24 triples up. Again, in many instances, I have to drive to present the proposal. So time begins to tick like that. If you're inside, you're good. You have a different way to deal with time, but probably your metrics are a little bit different. But once you get a hold of your metrics, you're in a position to get a hold of time because now you can begin to allocate based on actual numbers. The reverse of that is that I can also decide which activities I want to focus on. And what you notice mathematically, and I know sometimes people don't think of it like that in sales, is if I can reduce the number of proposals that it takes for me to get a sale, the net effect of that is I need less appointments during the day. So what I'm telling you is that, yes, work on your prospecting. What you may find if you put some attention to other elements of your sale, you'll notice that the need to prospect diminishes, which means you have more time to do other things. If you want me to straighten that out, give me a call. Let's look at the other side of it, which is the context and how we communicate value to our prospects and how we pack that into a prospecting statement on the telephone, email, or LinkedIn. This is our view, salespeople's view of a particular business or particular company. We see different opportunities, different pockets, different departments, different people within that department. In the window, almost over to the right, we see the lady struggling with whatever she is opening. Clearly, she has a need or a problem that I have the solution for. Up on the left there, we see somebody who's a bit innovative. Clearly, they will align to our other element of the product. So we look at the company very segmented along these ways. The decision makers, I'm going to argue, have a different view of the company, and they're looking outside from the inside. And what they're seeing over the horizon is many opportunities, much upside, and a lot of ways that they can gain value for their company. But along the way, they also see threats and potential detours and potential things that can derail the way. And what they're looking for is ways to get to those mountains where the gold is without having to deal with too much of some of the gaps, some of the hurdles, some of the things we talked about earlier that deal with particular destinations. So at times, what we talk about as salespeople intersects with what the prospect is thinking about. What we want to do is make that align more to what they're thinking about as opposed to just being an intersection. What we want to do is help them understand how our product, how our offering can help them overcome some of the challenges that they see between here and where they want to be down the road over at the mountains. So rather than talking about the problems, let's talk about how we've been able to get others to the objectives, to the destination, to where they're trying to get to in their company. So let's narrow that down to your market, to your service. And about 10% of that market at any given time is going to be actively looking. And by that I mean they might have an order that they need to increase capacity. They might have a machine that's broken down unexpectedly, so they need to replace that as a result. And that's where the salespeople are out there on the countryside looking for problems, looking for solutions, do well. But, you know, in reality, as we've read about in other sources, many of these customers have initiated the purchase on their own. They're 57, if not more % along the way through the buying journey, not the sales journey, but the buying journey. And all they're looking from us is discounts and so on. So again, it's part of the customer base. It's a small part of the customer base. Unfortunately, too much of our efforts are geared to that customer base. You know, the thing to look for is how can I minimize the time that it takes me to sell to somebody who already knows what they want, where they want it, how they want it, versus somebody that doesn't know anything about us and how we can help them. So think about how you can minimize the time it takes to sell them. About 20% is passively looking. These people might be somebody that has to replace a machine or maybe has a lease running out in 18 months. And, you know, last time, 5 years ago, they made this purchase. It took them 5 months to do it. And the key here is that 5 years ago, how many sales do you get in the course of 5 years? They only go through this once. So you have to make up for that difference because their expectations are entirely different than yours. But last time, it took them 5 months to make the decision. So they got 18 months. They figured they're going to pad that by 7 to give them some cushion. So they figured they've got it, 11 months before they really need to go into active mode. Now, these are great customers, and I'm not suggesting in any way that we minimize their importance, but it's important we understand that it's next year quota. But it's also important that you shouldn't give up on that because it gives you a long runway to become their emotional favorite. So don't think about it as a lost opportunity now because, yes, it won't be this year, But if you can stack a number of these into next year, I would suggest that you're going to have it easier next year. So these are important from a time perspective, and any time that you steal from the active, I would reinvest it here because more of those are going to turn your way when the time comes. That leaves us with the vast majority, the status quo or status quo, depending which side of the ocean you're on, that are, generally not responsive to the messages that have been geared towards the other two types of customers. And if we look at the status quo, they're generally thought of as happy, they're generally thought of as not looking, they generally thought of as the biggest competition a sales rep has. And, we think they're averse to change, although some studies suggest that maybe we're misinterpreting things, but that's another webinar. The one thing that a lot of people agree on is that they're satisfied, and there's this notion in our society somehow satisfaction equals loyalty, and as a result, the effort may not be worthwhile. So what we get is a lot of effort being put into the two areas that are active or passive, and there's a lot of ignoring of the status quo, because most, I think, people haven't figured out that when you call somebody in the status quo and you say you're from the latest software company that solves this problem, but they don't see their problem because they're status quo. I'm not saying they don't have it, they just don't see it. If they don't see that problem, then the natural response is, no, we don't need it, and that's why we get all that rejection. So maybe the question is changing the message, because how we present the call is going to generate the reaction. And maybe we're just asking the wrong question and we're getting the answer to that. And if we change the question, perhaps we get the right answer. Go with me here. So around the time that I finished my last book with my co-author on trigger events, there were a number of things in that book that still I'm concerned about because I'm not sure they're correct. So one of the things that it talks about is that you can't get money from the status quo. A particular point is made that a large percentage of the buying population is status quo, zero chance of buying. The reality is I've had a career of making money in the status quo, and I started doing research around why there's this perceived notion of loyalty around satisfaction. But what I found, much to my, I don't know if it's chagrin or satisfaction, let's go with chagrin just because it's not satisfaction, is that there isn't really a correlation or a direct tie or close link between loyalty and satisfaction. One example you can see on your screen from Bell and Patterson is that 75% of customers who switch from one vendor to another, to a direct competitor, when asked, said that they were satisfied or completely satisfied at the time they switched, right? So goodbye window of dissatisfaction, because you don't need to wait that long. You just need to figure out what to say to these people, because 75% of them were willing to switch when they were satisfied, so why wait? Let's jump into it. The only thing we need to figure out is what these salespeople were saying that was different than we're saying in order to get them to switch while they were in fact satisfied. So get rid of the old thing, think about what all these people have in common that we can talk to instead of having to reinvent the wheel all the time. So when I talked to some of my customers, people who left me, people who I won from others who I thought that I couldn't win, but I won, and I asked them what the deal was. And after a while, what I discovered is one thing that came through, a straight line that intersected all of them, the thread of all their needles, is the one thing that they all had in common was objectives. Now, the actively looking were looking to get rid of whatever problem or immediate issue they had. Let's look at it positively. They needed to get greater capacity to satisfy a big order, right? So the problem in the immediate sense was solving the machine, but they still have ongoing objectives as a business to grow that side of it that they're buying the machine for and so on. So there's life beyond the pain. So you can help them continue to focus on the long-term objective while solving the immediate pain, in the process capturing the long-term attention. Similarly, we talked about being the emotional favorite with 20% being passively looking. You can still work with them without investing a lot of time, and we can talk later, or you can approach me about some of the ways of doing it without investing a lot of time and keeping them focused on you, your message, and your view of the world, so when the time comes, you can go after them. So their objectives are to make it through from now until the time they need to go into the buying process, so you can help them prepare in that what they're going to face. Remember, they haven't done it in 5 years, you have, right? So you can share a lot of your insights with them about what's changed, not about your product, but what's changed since the last time that they've gone through this process. So when they hit the process and they begin to see some of the things that you told them were going to happen are in fact happening, there's more credibility that you have, so there's more reason for them to deal with you. And as they drop into the active zone full blown, who are they more likely to feel comfortable completing the journey with? The one that helped them focus on their long-term objective while addressing their immediate need, which was insight as to how the process changed, not about your product. And then the 70% that aren't willing to acknowledge your message, whether they have the problem you've identified or not. And I agree with you, many instances they do have the problem. What we need to do is acknowledge it, not talk about it. So us talking about it is not enough. They need to acknowledge it, or else there's no engagement. But if you look at those 70%, they too have long-term objectives. So even though they're not willing to admit to you that they have a current problem, they do have long-term objectives. So the one thing they all have in common is objectives. So let's redefine or look at the way that we look at the world. Let's get rid of the old notion that they're happy, they're not looking, and they're close to alternatives. And let's adopt a new one where we look at the world through a different lens. And we suggest that maybe we're getting all that rejection from the status quo because we've yet to present or they've yet to perceive things that help them achieve a means of getting to their objectives. If you call them and say, do you have this problem? It has nothing to do with the fact that they might want to penetrate a market that they're not in. So you're inviting the answer of no. If you were to ask them or talk to them or highlight how you might be able to help companies like theirs penetrate new markets, you may have a conversation. Keep that as the starting point. So one of the things that we need to do if we're going to communicate to customers is we need to have a solid understanding of what the value is. And unfortunately, value has a lot of different definitions. We went through various iterations as an industry, from elevator pitch to unique selling proposition, and it seems the current favorite is value proposition. Unfortunately for me, it's not really moving the dial that much. If you read through the definition, it's still a scheme that I'm proposing. It's the terms of a transaction. You can say a lot of things on it. You could put lipstick on it, but can't get away from the fact that it's still a pitch. So what we like to do is work with a solid definition with our clients, one that doesn't move with what's happening in the market. So as a result of that, we can stay focused on how we deliver value to a specific customer. And that is that any offering that we have, whether it's a software, trucks, whatever the things are, any offering that helps them remove barriers or obstacles or helps them bridge gaps between where they are today and what their objectives are. And again, since every business has objectives, midterm or long-term, there's always something that we can utilize to have that conversation with. So looking at it from the other side, if we talk about pains and problems instead of talking about long-term objectives, the other things that we tend to talk about are things as opposed to what the customer is looking for, which are really more tied to results and business impacts. And so what I'd like you to focus on in terms of the script that we're going to be building and the message that we're going to be delivering through the call that we're going to be making is what are the specific objectives that the customer has that we can tie things to. Again, realistically, we're not going to know everybody that we call, so we are going to focus it down and group it down in different ways. And we're going to start that process by looking at what I call the objective value stack. So to use the parlance of today, we're going to use persona. I'm not sure it's correct, but everybody seems to understand it. What are the things that are impacting them by virtue of their roles? So again, marketing people are going to look at things differently than finance people. Neither is right or wrong. They all have their own lenses. In addition to that, we're going to look at how time goes in their favor, productivity, financial, risk avoidance, and we're going to put a specific focus on productivity. By time shifting, again, time doesn't change for the prospect either, so can you get it to market quicker? Can you make something last longer? Shifting time in their favor. Financial, I'd like you to get off the obvious, like, the fact that you can increase the revenue or take cost out that results in greater margin is sort of like not news anymore. It's table stakes. I don't think you can get in there if you can't show that like in the first 5 minutes. So I'm not sure that that represents financial anymore. But you can get specific, how are they utilizing a line of credits that's impacting their ability to borrow on future projects that could accelerate their cash flow? How are they paying for their inventory? Things along those lines. How is their cost structure aligned with different elements of the inputs where they can maybe reduce the margins by doing something differently? How can you consolidate processes for them? So there's more to financial, and again, these things are interdependent. Some of these tie back to productivity, shifting time. Stay away from the common stuff that other people are doing on an ongoing basis. And risk avoidance, there's probably specific things to each industry, but what I want you to think about is there is an opportunity to show the customer a risk that they've overlooked or risk that they've ignored that if they were to actually accept and look at may cause them not to be status quo anymore. But again, align more to more objectives as opposed to just being a boogeyman for the sake of being a boogeyman. But again, productivity I highlighted because it's one of those words like efficiency or solutions and many others that to me are what I call empty calorie words in sales. They've lost their nutritional value when it comes to helping us get sales. Because the 6,000 times, it just sort of wears down. So the first few hundred times they heard productivity, that sounds interesting. But you can't just leave it hanging. And a lot of salespeople just leave it hanging. They'll say, oh, we help you increase productivity. But again, they've had 6,000 chances to listen to these things, and they no longer listen to them. They see them as patterns. And certain words trigger certain reactions. And as soon as you say productivity, you're going to suffer the same fate of the 6,000 previous guys. And I think that's something you don't want to do. So you can't get rid of the concept, notion, or word, but I think you can present it in a way that makes more sense. And the problem with it is, after a while, when they realize that it means nothing, they've learned to ignore it. So if you can wrap something around it, and again, don't think about paragraphs or sentences, so think about imagery. A picture is worth 1,000 words, and later I'll give you some specific examples. If you can think of an imagery that helps them categorize what you mean by productivity, then it has some meaning. So again, they just have to categorize it mentally. They don't need to write a dissertation on it. So we'll talk about how you can use imagery to get them to categorize it. And once it checks that box, you're okay with that image. But just don't leave it hanging along with efficiency. There was a company in town who shall remain nameless, where it was like an Abbott and Costello routine where I asked them what they do best, and they said they impact productivity. And I asked them, great, how do you do that? And they said that they improve their efficiency. And I said, wonderful, how do you do that? And they said by impacting their productivity. It literally went back and forth like that for about 3 minutes. So the only drag is that I don't have a video of it. Anyways, objectives are very solid. Again, I would argue that they're more powerful than pain, needs, and solutions. Those may be scary, but over the long run, people get past them. Everybody out there has objectives. Not everybody has pains or needs a solution. The question is, do you think you can survive on what your competitors leave as sort of crumbs once they finish? Again, not everybody that you identify as being potentially having the pain, so in that segment or in that persona, is going to admit to you that they have that, and as a result, they're not going to want to talk about your solutions. The other is pains are very short-lived. People learn to cope, they get they get an aspirin, and they focus on their long-term goals, which is why objectives are better. They're long-term, they're uplifting, and people can't get enough of a good thing, so leverage them. So what I want to do in the process of beginning to write your script and getting into the mechanics of it, because that's important, is I want you to stop the webinar, and before you do that, think about 3 business objectives that you can help your customers address. And by that, I don't mean that you can give them more copies per second or what your product does. I really don't want you to focus on what your product does or how you do it. What I want you to focus on is how the customer sees the difference. Is it because their trucks can make 1 more stop a day? Is it because they're able to eliminate 1 more service call that's needed and therefore save time in that way? So what are the outcomes that their customers see as being important? So that is your customers' customers. And then think about those objectives, and we'll come back in a moment. So I'm hoping you finish that exercise, because we're going to use that going into how we build a script. And the process that we're going to use is a 5-step process, 5.5 as you can see. We're going to talk about how we initiate the call, and we're not going to spend time on that today, just few time restrictions. If you want to learn more, just feel free to reach out. You need to engage the individual, and that's when we introduce how we use impact questions. That should set you up to be ready to ask for the appointment. As I mentioned earlier, you're going to get an objection, so you need to take that away, and then you're going to focus on securing the appointment. What I want you to think about is not doing exactly as I say, because these two are so different. It's just that you hit each of those 5 markers, and that's what you should focus on. As long as I can hit each of those 5 things in progress, I'm off to the races. As I said, I'm going to skip the initiate. It's got some specifics, but you can reach out. Let's look at the engage part, which involves the impact question, which I think is the area where you can implement some of the things we talked about. And what we're going to look at is, this is basically the approach that I use on the telephone. Some things vary based on circumstance, but the structure is very much what I use. I'll reach out to Harvey and I'll say, my name is Tibor Shanto, calling you from Renbor. You're probably not familiar with us, or I might say probably not familiar with what we do. I'll say you probably don't know, because that sort of gives them the opportunity to sort of shut things down. But being familiar is a bit more interesting iteration of the same thing. Not familiar with us, but companies like, and this is where I go for the halo effect. I want that recognition because I'm admitting that they're not familiar with me, but if they can recognize some of my customers, I'm hoping that there's this invisible sort of, yeah, if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for me. So Bell Mobility was in fact a customer, as was Imperial Oil. This gives me credibility in Canada because most Canadians will know one, if not both. So I get to sort of check mark that they've at least put them through the paces. And then I pick an industry-specific one. So one of the advantages is that you can pick one that you've worked with as a competitor that would recognize, that would demonstrate that you have some understanding of what they do. And so what I say is that da-da-da-da-da, and then Acme Corp, their industry, these people have relied on us too. And then I give them 3 things that I think relate to specific objectives. So one is I tell them that I've helped companies improve activity in their pipeline. I tell them that I've helped companies shorten their sales cycle. And you know what they tell me in the process, Harvey, is that the accuracy of their forecast has also improved. So let's look at this graphically. So if you go back to the objective stack on the left, some of these specific objectives that you know exist for your customers because you're aware of your marketplace. And then again, pipeline activity, whether it's prospecting, opportunity management, whatever that relates to flow through the pipeline, that will check off the productivity box. Shortening the sales cycle, which I'm not always a believer in, but I've been able to do for a lot of companies, checks their need to shift time in something more favorable to them. And I know on a personal level, the level of accuracy has become much more important to individuals. So I'm trying to get to their specific role-based stuff to say that as a result of the work we do, you're likely going to get more accurate forecasts. I'm not saying that's what we deliver, but that's one of the benefits that they'll get, or extensions that they get. So graphically, if you will, it looks something like this, where you have the buyer who looks suspiciously a lot like that guy, Ryan, from the American Congress. And you have the objectives on the other side of the cliff. If I can get them closer, if you can move them closer to their objectives, as we talked about earlier, you will be able to demonstrate value. And you don't need to do that in one fell swoop. You know, you might not make it all the way in fall. What you could do is do it incrementally. So I don't want you to put pressure on yourself on trying to figure out how you get to the other end. What you want to do is figure out how you do the next step. Because if you can get an incremental step forward, you will have worked with this person, you will have gotten comfortable, you both will have discovered some new mutual things, which allows you to set a new footing, which you can then build the next incremental step from, the next incremental step from, etc. So don't put pressure on yourself to leap across, make your way across in a constructive way. What follows that type of introduction, so once I highlight the 3 objective areas that from experience I know have worked for me over the past, the next thing I want to do is bring them in, and I want to test whether any of these really resonate with them. So what I go to is what I call an impact question. I'll be completely honest, it really is nothing more than a closed-ended question because I'm looking for a yes or I'm looking for a no, because a yes is like a green field that, you know, it's unplayed with, I can do whatever I want. a no really is equal to an objection, and I just deal with it in the way that I'll demonstrate that we deal with objections in a few minutes. So there's no fear for me to have that closed-ended question. I know a lot of people, closed-ended questions have gotten a bad rap since the 70s. I would not use them in the same ways in the face-to-face meeting, but prospecting is not a face-to-face meeting. This closed-ended question allows you to go to the next step, which is to say, is this something that's of concern to you? Is this something that we can sit down and talk about? In my particular example, when I go through the elements in that slide, that I do this, this, and this, I simply ask them a very simple question, because again, the idea is not to trip them up, but to allow them to say a simple yes or no. That's what you want, is you want them in and involved. So I simply ask them, I'm curious, do you have any initiatives like that currently in your company? Because if they say yes, I can talk about how I've accelerated existing programs. And if they say no, then I can talk to them about how the impact of these programs have companies, and we should really get together and talk. So there's no fear, no downside to an impact question. It's just figuring out the right one. And I've yet to meet an industry that we can come up with at least 2 or 3 impact questions that then prove themselves to be more than effective in the field. So obviously, there's no getting away from objections. I hope I've been honest enough to say, and then, we're not going to be able to cover every single one. But today my goal is to cover 5 that would cover about 80% of the objections that you're likely to face out there in the marketplace. And to me, I figure it's pretty good news, because if I could cover 80% of what I'm about to face and be ready for it, which I think what most sales professionals fail to do is get ready, then I should be able to cover off a lot and engage a lot more customers. And again, as you can see, status quo, complete lack of interest, any form of lack of time, they're busy now, or any time between now and the second coming. They've had a bad experience with your company or something in your universe, and at the same time, the proverbial favor when they ask you to send them stuff, and people actually still do. So let's take a look at the nature of the objection and really put it into context, which is hard, but if you work at it, it really helps, which is it's really not personal. And I know that you face it a good chunk of the time. I know that in the course of an hour when I'm on the phone making prospecting calls, which I still do regularly, it's not the most pleasant thing, but if you put it into context, it's something you can actually deal with, and if you can deal with it, you'll change the outcome, improve the results. So if you picture an example of myself and my wife going to a typical department store, let's say Sears in Canada, and we say that, or they completely shut down? Well, let's say the Bay in Canada. As I'm walking through the mall and I enter the Bay, a very nice person, as I'm having a conversation with my wife, approaches me and said, "May I help you?" What do I and 95% of the population say? I say, "No, I'm just looking because I want to continue the conversation with my wife." 5 minutes later, I start complaining how this place has no service, remember, when Eaton's used to run it, blah, 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 blah. So let's roll it back. Same wife, same mall, same day, same everything, but maybe things are a little bit different this time. Let's say I walk in, same clerk comes up to me and says, "May I help you?" And I say, "I'm just looking." But instead of accepting that as face value or just accepting whatever they said, they say instead, "That's okay. If you tell me what you're looking for, perhaps I could show you where it is." And just by asking that question, it changes the nature of that engagement, and more of us are likely to engage. I'm not saying all of us are going to say, "Oh yeah, hallelujah, let's go." But the reality is that more of us are likely to respond to that second statement that that person makes than if we just take it at face value. And that's how I want you to look at objections. First of all, I don't want you to get emotionally invested. They have nothing to do with you. The other is, again, it's the way that you handle it, as we talked about earlier. It's what you do with it. It's not avoiding it. There's no avoiding it unless you want to change careers. So we're going to talk about objections, shameless plug time. You can download that ebook for free, or you can buy it for $12.75 on Amazon, whichever you prefer. I'm happy with either. But it'll walk you through in more detail what I'm about to walk through relatively quickly, but hopefully in an understandable way. But there's 4 elements that you need to think about when it comes to objectives. One is you got to acknowledge, objections. One is you got to acknowledge what the person's saying. The thing we hate most about these telemarketers who call us in the evening is they never stop to acknowledge what we say. So as a result, it becomes a very disingenuous conversation and not really a good beginning for a sale. There's quite a bit. But then what I want you to do next is say something along the lines that will give you credibility. Because again, being an interruption, there's not a lot of credibility out of the gate. But if I can address that objection in a credible way that C then involves them, then I have a way of beginning the conversation. If we think about what the title of this webinar is, which is how do we turn an interruption into a conversation, that is our goal. And then the final thing is we always want to, in an objection, come back to our original goal, which is to get the appointment. So we want to get a call to action, we want to get a commitment. Otherwise, all this exercise is for naught. So I'm going to walk you through one example. I encourage you to download the free ebook, or you can download it free. I should encourage you to buy it, but go ahead and download it free. And I'll walk you through one, and consult the book for the others. So imagine the status quo. This is somebody that if you state an objective that you think that they may have, because you've been able to address it with other companies, and they still come back to you and they say something to the effect that they're all set, we're good, we're already dealing with someone, we're happy with our current vendor. So any iteration of the usual we're all good type of thing. What I want you to think about is, how do I acknowledge that? So the first thing I got to do is say, you know what, I understand exactly what you mean. It's interesting that you would say that, or, I know exactly what you mean because so and so. So again, instead of pushing back on it right away, which was a lot of salespeople do, they're telling you they're all set. I think that's worth acknowledging. I think it's even worth asking, how they came to the conclusion of using that. But, generally I just say, you know what, I understand exactly what you mean. It's not the first time that I faced this. And then in terms of involving them, I think I'm giving them credibility by acknowledging it. And then I turn to give an example of how I've worked with somebody that was already engaged with somebody else. And most of us have had instances where we're either co-engaged or where we've actually won a competitor's account. I mean, all of us are set out to win competitors' accounts. So what was the common reason that seems to get your competitor's account to switch to you? Because if it's good enough to get them to switch, I would argue it's probably good enough to put in front of this person. And it's clear that 75% of them will respond to the right, point of view. So all I have to do is present that to them. So the question becomes, how can I enhance what they are currently doing? How can I match what they're currently doing? How can I fit what they're currently doing? How can I expand leverage? How can I get into the tent? Because you know what they say about being inside the tent versus outside the tent. So again, and then I go to, how can I help them understand what it is that I do? So I go and ask for the appointment. So a specific example, a few years back, I did a lot of work with the Business Development Bank of Canada. Like most organizations, and this isn't speaking out of school because it so happens that I have a case study on my website that you can download that just helps validate the way that I take away this objection. So again, if you have been in the business for any amount of time, there are examples that you can use like this, and you should be asking customers for testimonials for exact purpose of having examples like this that you can use in the context of taking away objections, if not other important elements of your sales success. So a lot of these big companies, the banks and large companies, they already have either an internal sales department or a third party like myself or some combination of these things. So it really shouldn't be a surprise if you're selling copiers that they actually have a copier, unless accidentally that building went overnight and you missed it on your way to work yesterday. So again, the fact that they're all set is almost a go-to or what you should expect out of the gate. So the example, so I know from experience that most of the organizations are set. So the question I have to figure out is, beyond being all set, what are they not set in? And one of the things that I learned from dealing with the many companies that I have is that most of them have difficulty getting adoption or implementation of programs that they teach. So they get bonus marks for delivering the program, but a lot of companies struggle to demonstrate that what they were taught is actually being put into practice. And as a result, some of the people in that particular area are looking for ways that they can demonstrate that their existence actually has value. So when they hear but somebody can help them with that area, it becomes an entirely different conversation. So if you look at the way that I deal with the objections that I get, we're all set, we're good, we have an internal trainer we've been working with, so and so for a number of years, I say, it's interesting that you would say that because the business development bank said the exact same thing. So again, I acknowledge it, I demonstrate that I'm familiar with this kind of situation and I've dealt with it in the past and I've had a successful outcome because they said the exact same thing before they saw how we helped accelerate adoption of their internal programs. So notice I didn't put my program up against theirs. I don't sit there and say who's bigger, who's smaller. I focus on the fact that I know that they have this issue, and the issue has nothing to do with my program. It has to do with getting adoption of other programs. So the discussion now becomes, is there a method that's going to help them increase adoption? It's no longer a question of whether they want to see Tibor's prospecting program. It's really a question of, can I have the same impact for them as I seem to have had for the BDC? And then I simply tie it up as per point D, and I say, let me show you how we did that. How's Wednesday, 11? And for me, I'm not fighting the customer. I'm just saying, dude, I know exactly where you're coming from because I've been there, done that. Here was the outcome. Here's why they're happy. I can show you why. And generally, if you take a calmer approach like that, you'll find that they have a much calmer response. I do want to be clear that this is just taking away the first objection. That doesn't mean that they're going to throw up their hand and say, yeah, what do you want to sell me? But I'm suggesting that it gets rid of that one conditioned response that the 6,000 times that they practiced before you called has gotten them into the routine of. And they're accustomed that if they throw out that objection, salesperson generally flounders and it gives them a chance to hang up. Whereas if you can actually overcome that objection, handle it in a professional fashion, the next objection they give you is at least something that has to be a bit more considered as opposed to conditioned. No guarantee that it'll be any more positive, but it'll be more considered. And what I recommend is go at least 3 times, and at the end of that, professionally disengage. And we can talk about how you do that if we ever meet face to face. But the goal is go 3 objectives, but if you can take away the first one, you've already differentiated yourself from the 6,000 others. So as we look at that before that even happens, one of the things that you have to go through as you go through the book and you do the various objections, what you'll find is that most of them tend to be linear. It's I say this, they say that, they say this, I say that. But often things don't unfold that way, and often things will react to a specific thing. And one of the things that I want you to get comfortable with is closing down certain paths that prospects can take and then shutting them down and ensuring that you don't have to face an objection that you're not prepared for. I'll give you an example. I was doing some work with an office equipment company, and every time, because they were a global brand, every time they called a small local brand, because of the association of the global brand, the small local company would go, oh, no, 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 we're too small, we're too small, we're too small. So after a while, we began to examine how we can deal with it, and we changed our calling script. And instead of having 3 company references, we changed it to 1, and we changed it out to say that we are the small company specialists. So by adding in that we're the small company specialists, what's the individual going to do? We're minuscule. They really can't take that away because we acknowledge that we deal specifically with small companies. Now, it doesn't guarantee that you're not going to get any of the other 5, but if we're ready for the other 5, it makes that call a bit easier. Similarly, when you send somebody information, typically what happens is you call them back a week later, they either haven't got it, which would be completely contrary to the promises the post office makes, or they haven't had a chance to read it. So why not, knowing that they're going to say that, why not the callback say, hey, Harvey, it's Tibor, I'm following up on the stuff that I sent you. You probably haven't had a chance to read it yet, have you? Just the nervous laughter alone that you get at that point is worth the call alone, but most of the time they go, no, I didn't get a chance to read it, which is a perfect opportunity to say, that's why I suggested we get together, because I could probably walk you through it, answer your questions immediately so you can be a bit more comfortable with what it is that we do. How's Tuesday at 11? So again, same pattern, but you can walk through it. And similarly, again, if you find that people are resistant, you can talk about how you work with clients, their competitors specifically, where they've decided to take a proactive stance, and you've helped them in that success. So again, first time it's a surprise, second time it's validation, and then the third time it's up to us to be ready. And I'll close off with voicemail, which I know is everybody's favorite. And I would really get you to think about it through a different angle again, and think about what it is that you're trying to achieve. And I think that in most instances, salespeople overreach when it comes to voicemail. They try to either go straight for the appointment in the voicemail, they try to like go into a proposal. I've seen people go all the way for the sale. So that's not the right purpose for voicemail, which is why we tend to get bad results. The singular purpose of voicemail is not to reach out and try and sell somebody, but in fact it is strictly to get a call back. Once you get a call back, then you can apply the things that you touched on earlier that we tend to cover during the program. And once you get the call back, then you can put all those things into practice. But what happens if you don't wait for that call back is the dynamics, as we touched on earlier, don't change at the other end of the call. 90% of voicemails that you hear will end by saying, please leave a detailed message. And why do they want that detailed message? Because like me, like you, they're using voicemail as a triage, right? They want to know exactly why it is that they don't call you back, so they can do a thumbs down. But the reality is that their thought process doesn't change. If your live call unfolded in one way, it wouldn't end up any different. So the reality is, if you look at the call the way it's structured, what specifically is missing is you're not there to take away the objection, but they're formulating the way you would be live if they actually articulated that objection to you. So as a result, you need to come up with a message that is titillating enough that they'll want to take action, but doesn't give them too much information. And it's trying to complete that picture, trying to complete that mystery that's going to compel them to call back. And to be honest, I get about 4 to 5 messages that I leave. I get returned within about 72 hours using this technique, but it's a very specific technique. It takes practice. It's simple from the standpoint of execution. It's just habitually it's a little bit hard for some people to get excited about. But there's a load of videos up on that YouTube link that you see at the top of the slide. There's also a free online course that you can register in that'll get you prepared for getting more calls back on voicemail. But here's some core assumptions that I want you to take on as I demonstrate the technique, and you can try and let me know how you make out with it. So assume that you work as a representative for Top Choice. Doesn't matter what Top Choice does. And then the person that you're trying to have an appointment with, or you're trying to prospect, is Steve Jones, who works for Central Trucking. And then let's also accept that down the road is a competitor, and you have done business with them. Top Choice has been a provider, and they've been a happy customer of yours for years. So if you get somebody's voicemail and you listen to the entire outbound message, what I want you to start with is identifying yourself. So I might say that this is Tibor Shanto. Let's say Steve Jones, this is Tibor Shanto from Top Choice. So identify myself and my company. And then I move on to giving my phone number. There's a couple of things I'd like to highlight when it comes to giving the phone number. The first thing, the speed with which you give it. There's nothing more irritating than having to rewind to get your number just to find out you're a sales guy. So act different than a sales guy. Slow down. And the easiest way to do it is pretend that you're writing your own number. So I want you to visualize you writing down your own phone number as you'll be leaving the individual's voicemail. And that will allow you to deliver at a speed that's going to be easy for that individual to take down. And again, you get the silent bonus points. The other thing I want you to do is stay away from the words, please call me back at your earliest convenience. Nothing smells more like a salesperson in voicemail than those set of words. So say something that's a bit more direct and authoritative. I can reach that. You can call me back. Be direct. I would suggest leave out the word please, not to be rude, but just to be a bit dramatic. And then the last thing I read, and the other reason that I give them my phone number at this point is people continue to take data until they make up their mind as to whether they're interested or not. So having not given them any data, any point with which they can make up their mind, again, they're going to continue taking that number down. And then the last thing I give them is what I call a third-party referral. That's the name of a client that I've done business with. So you got to be clean on that. Can't make it up. It has to be legit. So a company that I've done business with, in this case, Down the Road Trucking, and I leave them as a reference. And my goal is for Steve Jones to think, why is this person who I've never heard of calling me and asking me to call them back, referring to my competitor? And this is why I get 60, 70%, 40 to 50% of calls returned, because most people are curious. And again, we all know about curiosity and the cat, and most people act on it. I know that I do, and I have dozens and dozens of customers where the relationship started in this way. We talked about persistence as being key. Most people give up after 3. Stats have shown that you need to be way more persistent. You could look at this as one flow. Clearly, in Canada, you might have to think about some of this from a castle point of view, but I would argue that this is just the beginning. And also, if you've taken them through one set of cycles, don't forget that leads are in fact recyclable, so you can approach them again. If I have a VP of sales who turns me down in January, I generally will call them back beginning of April, because I know they're looking at the quarterly numbers and they might have a different impression of life than they did 3 months ago. My name is Tibor Shanto. There's a couple of downloads there you can get for free. I mentioned the book that I won an award for. You can download, you can go to Amazon using that link. If you have questions, feel free to call, feel free to send me an email. Again, you can download this presentation through the link at the bottom left, and you can look at a form of the presentation and the voicemail program and the handouts looking at these slides. Thanks.